Module number 1, understanding flavor. So before we will start discussing beer flavor and beer flavor components, I think it's pretty important to understand what is actually flavor and what stands behind the definition of flavor. So let me just read out loud this definition. Flavor is the sum of perceptions resulting from stimulation of the sense ends that are grouped together at the entrance of the alimentary and respiratory tracts. And the key words here in this definition is the sum of perceptions. So this indicates that flavor is not just one perception, but there are several components comprising the overall flavor. So referring now to the previous definition of flavor and this sum of perceptions, we mean nothing else than just the overall sense interaction of odor, aroma, taste, and mouthfeel. And odor and aroma, although they both refer to the sense of smell, they are different. That's what we're going to cover in the next slides. Taste refers to the sense of taste, and mouthfeel refers to this haptic perception. It's the sense of touch, tactile. That's pretty much it. So even the sense of touch, to a certain extent, can affect flavor. Just a second ago, I said that there is a difference between odor and aroma. And yes, there are two manners in which we can perceive smell. The first of them is the orthonasal aroma, and the second of them is the retronasal aroma. So the orthonasal aroma, often abbreviated as odor, it's nothing else as a perception of volatiles by the olfactory receptors in the nasal cavity after sniffing through the nose. So you take the product, you sniff it, the stimulus of the smell perception is created, and that's pretty much it. But retronasal aroma, it's something way different. Retronasal aroma, often abbreviated as aroma, it results from the volatilization of aroma compounds by body heat after taking the food product in the mouth. The volatile compounds reach the nasal cavity via retronasal manner. So it's something way different. You introduce the food product into your mouth, you distribute it in your mouth, it warms up, the volatiles are transmitting through the back of your throat. They reach the nasal cavity, and then they are perceived by olfactory receptors. So it's something, these two are completely different. Okay, this graphical interpretation of orthonasal and retronasal smell perception will help to understand better and to memorize what is the difference between these two. And the first one, orthonasal, it's from out there. So as I said, you take the product, you sniff it, the volatiles get to the nasal cavity straight, and the olfactory receptors, they create a stimulus. That's pretty much it. Whereas the retronasal, it's from in the mouth, right? So it's from the inside the mouth. So the product is distributed in the mouth, it's warmed up, it causes the migration of the volatiles through the back of your throat into the nasal cavity. The olfactory receptors, they create a stimulus, and it's a different mechanism. Now, somebody can ask, okay, but smell is smell. What is the difference between these two? Is there any difference, right? Besides this mechanism on the perception? And I will tell you that yes, there is a difference. And especially good example for this is beer. Very often when you take the beer and you smell it first, when you sniff it, it might have, like, for instance, let me say, this kind of estery, fruity, juicy smell, kind of, yeah, let's just say that's it, right? And then when you take the sip of the beer, when you keep it a little bit in your mouth, when it warms up, then you swallow it, and then you have something completely different in the nose. So it doesn't mean that one is better than the other one. No, they're just different. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that often one might be better, for example, orthonasal might be better for perception of, let me think, sulfuric compounds, right? With short sniffs, you can perceive very well, for example, hydrochloric acid, right? Or DMS. Whereas retronasal might be better for hop products, right? For hop aromas, right? So this is important um, to clearly understand the difference between these two mechanisms. Okay, having covered the sense of smell, let's move now to the sense of taste. And taste, here the case is a bit easier because taste is the perception of soluble substances in the mouth by receptors located mostly on the tongue. And there are only 5 attributes that taste is limited to. And these are sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and the recently added umami. Umami is like this soy sauce kind of glutamate flavor. But anyways, the take-home message here is that flavor is perceived mostly by the tongue, right? So you have to introduce the product into your mouth, the substances, they solubilize, and then they are perceived by the receptors located at the tongue, on the surface of the tongue. So that's the first take-home message, and the second take-home message is that it's only limited to 5 attributes: sweet, sour, bitter, umami, and salty, and that's it. And the last component of flavor is mouthfeel. As I said before, it refers more to the sense of touch, tactile, and by definition, mouthfeel is a haptic perception of the food product on the surface of the oral cavity. And a good example here is the warming effect of ethanol, or this gentle irritation caused by carbonation, or for instance, astringency, which is this dry effect in the mouth, right? And yeah, so flavor, it's not only about smell and taste, but also the accompanying stimulus perceived by the sense of touch. And that would be pretty much it about how we understand flavor, what is the flavor definition, and what are the flavor components. Okay, now let's move to the second part of this module, which is beer flavor. And here I would like to begin with one aspect, namely that beer is an extremely complex flavor matrix. And so far, hundreds and hundreds of compounds have been identified as flavor active in beer. And let's just think for a second about beer styles, right? There are sheer number of different beer styles, and obviously there are some flavor differences between them, and even more within a given category of a beer style. There will be some nuances if we compare, for example, Porter A to Porter B. And this is why it is so important to have this kind of standardized, structurized, and uniform terminology by which we can describe these flavors and then to compare or evaluate the beer flavor. Such terminology for the description of beer flavor was visualized in the so-called beer flavor wheel. And this was published by Meilgaard in the late 70s. And of course, since then, several suggestions for some adaptations or variations have been proposed and even successfully published. And even more, today, the beer flavor wheel can be found in analytical protocols of American Society of Brewing Chemists or European Brewing Convention. So yeah, it's a very clear and structurized terminology in which we can describe flavor, and that's why it's very often used by brewers and people working in the brewing industry. This slide covers the beer flavor wheel, so a visually structurized terminology used for the description of beer flavor. Now, this particular wheel was published in '79 by Meilgaard, and it's practically the first wheel ever to be seen. Now, the whole idea behind the structure of this wheel is that, first of all, each separately identifiable compound, maybe not compound, but a flavor, has got its own unique name, right? So each flavor has got its own name. And then second of all, that similar flavors, similar notes are grouped together. So for instance, in a group of cereal, number 3, you have grainy, malty, and worty. In the group of aromatic, fragrant, fruity, you have estery and fruity notes, right? So at that time, it was a very useful tool for brewers for the description of flavors that was offered with this wheel. But unfortunately, the disadvantage of this wheel was that it offered quite of a limited pool of flavor descriptors because, as I've told you, there are way more flavor active compounds that can be determined in beer, and this is just it's already quite a lot, but it's definitely not all of them that are covered with in this wheel. So in this slide, you can see a more recent adaptation of beer flavor wheel. And what you can see is that the pool of flavor descriptors is definitely more specific, more extended. It offers more flavor descriptors. But the concept behind the wheel is it's generally the same as before, so that similar flavors are grouped together and that each separately identifiable flavor has got its own unique name. All right, so now having covered the beer flavor wheel and flavor terminology, let's move a little bit in the direction of the metrics in beer sensory science. And here I would just like to mention the two most important ones, in my opinion: sensory threshold and flavor units. Now, sensory threshold is the concentration above which a given stimulus is perceived. So it's just the minimum concentration for a given compound to create the sensation, right? So this is the sensory threshold. Sensory thresholds, we're going to use them quite a lot in the next module. Now, it's very important to distinguish the detection threshold and recognition threshold. Detection threshold is when you get to samples, you can recognize that something is different about them, but you don't know really what. And this is that you can detect them, but not really recognize. And this is the recognition threshold. It's recognition is when you clearly can identify what is the sensation, what is the flavor. This is the recognition threshold. Now, flavor units, it's nothing else as assigning some sort of a magnitude for a sensation, for the flavor sensation. So by definition, it's the concentration of a compound in relation to a sensory threshold. It's sensory threshold. So let's say that if compound X is present in double the concentration in relation to its sensory threshold, then the flavor unit is 2. And that's pretty much about it. But unfortunately, there are a few practical limitations in relation to sensory evaluation. Now, first of all, I would like to draw your attention to one thing, and this is that beer is a very complex matrix. As I've mentioned before, there are like hundreds of flavor active compounds, and all of them are in different concentrations. They might interact with each other. And what do I mean by interact? I mean that there might create some synergy or masking effects. Synergy, it means that it can enhance that some compounds may enhance the perception of some other compounds. And masking, it means that they can completely mask the perception of other compounds, right? So this is pretty important, and whenever we do want to refer to some threshold values, we should actually refer to the actual threshold values determined in the actual product. And in our case, it's the beer, right? Because it doesn't make much sense to compare the threshold values, for instance, that were determined in water. That's the first thing. And now the second thing is that, now getting back a little bit to the flavor units theory, in reality, the relationship between the concentration of the given compound and the perceived sensory stimulus intensity is not linear. In practice, it's not linear. And why is that so? Because we are humans and we are not robots. We cannot simply, our senses are limited, and above reaching above some concentration, we are not able simply to detect differences. It means that our palate becomes oversaturated, and we simply cannot go further from this point on. With this graph, I would like to explain what I meant in the previous slide. On the y-axis, the sensory is covered. On the x-axis, the analytically determined concentration, right? So, the relation between the sensory perceived intensity and the compound's concentration, in theory, should be of a linear character, right? It should be a linear function. And this was depicted with the black line here in this graph, right? But in reality, it's not like this. This relation is more of a logarithmic character, and the sensory perceived intensity is definitely limited. And this comes from the fact, as I've mentioned before, that our senses are limited, and above certain concentration, we are simply unable to recognize any intensity differences, right, by our senses. And in the end, it makes sense. We are not robots, we are humans. Okay, so slowly we are reaching the end of the module number 1. So far we have covered the definition of flavor, flavor components. We've also talked a bit about beer flavor wheel, and we've also introduced the definition of thresholds and flavor units. Now, before we finish, I would like to draw your attention to one very important, in my opinion, aspect of sensory science, is that sometimes flavor is not just the taste, smell, and touch. Sometimes it can be affected also by other senses, like vision or hearing, right? And there are some studies, there are some experiments which prove that already by the appearance of the product, already, for instance, the quality of foam or the turbidity of the beer, people are able to make some associations with the flavor, right? Especially consumers. So flavor is not just the chemical senses are involved in flavor, but you just have to bear in mind that sometimes it can be approached from a little bit different angle, and it's the multi-sensory flavor experience, the overall multi-sensory experience, what I mean here. Okay, so that was quite a brief introduction into flavor. I hope that now it's a little bit more clear, a little bit more structurized the way you see flavor now. But before I finish, I would like to ask you one question. Why do we even care about flavor? Why is it so important for brewers? Why is it so important? Well, first of all, we have to realize that it's flavor being the most important criterion for evaluation of beer, right? So that's why it's so important and so essential for beer classification, for beer characterization and evaluation of its quality, right? In the end, it will be the flavor being the most important, always. Now, secondly, when a brewer develops a new recipe or wants to release a new product on the market, it's also pretty important for him to understand the flavor, to be able to compare and understand the differences in the flavor when he compares his product to the products of his competitors, right? In order to do so, he needs to understand what are the differences, and for this, of course, understanding flavor is also essential. Now, the third thing is product and brand consistency, and here it comes from the fact that consumers, they want the brewers to provide them always a consistent product, right? So if a customer goes to the shop and he wants to buy beer, let's call it a beer brand X, he expects that the flavor of this beer will be exactly the same as the one that he bought a month ago, 2 months ago, 6 months ago, maybe even 3 years ago, right? So this is important to understand the flavor, and again, to be able to control this flavor batch to batch on a long-term basis. And the last fourth thing is that understanding flavor gives the brewers a better control on beer stability, and this is especially important in relation to supply chain. Now, beer as a product is highly unstable in its flavor. During aging, beer flavor does deteriorate, and the changes are pretty detrimental for the product. Now, most of these things happen during the supply chain, so within the supply chain, so warehousing, transportation, distribution, and so on. Beer is exposed to highly unfavorable conditions then, especially high temperature and or vibrations, and some oxygen might penetrate into the bottle. And this is why it's so important to also, again, I highlight, understand the flavor and then be able to provide a better control.